In the brutal winter of 1892, in the deep valley of Timberline Gulch, nestled at the foot of the Elk Range in the Colorado Territory, at an elevation of nearly 10,900 feet, where winter winds regularly scour the ground like razor blades, a widow named Eleanor Whitford became the laughingstock of the entire mining camp when she declared she would build what the other miners mocked as the widow's stone igloo, instead of a proper log cabin like everyone else did to survive. The mountain winter. The 41 gold diggers in Timberline that season were convinced Eleanor had been driven mad by loneliness and the cold, and they had no hesitation saying it outright. Building a house out of stone in winter? An old-timer named Roy Calhoun bellowed, loud enough for the whole camp to hear. Next she'll be telling us to burn snow for heat. Laughter erupted instantly. Some slapped each other on the back, others bet on which week the widow would give up, because in their view no one in this region had ever survived in a frigid stone structure when temperatures plunged below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. But none of them could imagine that by February that year, when the temperature plummeted to -47 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 6 straight days, the odd structure Eleanor built, the one they ridiculed, sneered at, and saw as proof of her foolishness, would be the only shelter in the entire mining camp to maintain an interior temperature above freezing, while all the traditional log cabins around Timberline Gulch developed structural cracks from the extreme cold, and 3 of them became completely uninhabitable. No one could have imagined that the most mocked structure in the valley would become the only place with any warmth when the real winter descended on the mountains. Eleanor Whitford arrived in western Colorado in the summer of 1888 as part of the wave of families from the Northeast seeking fortune in America's booming mining camps. Before following her husband to Timberline Gulch, she had endured many winters in Bangor, Maine, but even the icy winds off the Atlantic could not compare to the bone-chilling cold of the high Colorado mountains. Her husband, Thomas Whitford, had spent 3 years working at a fishing camp near Baffin Bay, above the Arctic Circle, where winter temperatures regularly dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and staying warm was a true matter of survival. It was there that Thomas learned what most other men overlooked. The Inuit and Arctic fishermen built double-layered stone structures, leaving an air gap between the 2 walls to create natural insulation, and those structures maintained astonishing warmth with very little fuel. He had closely observed how they angled each stone slab to create air pockets, the precise thickness of the double walls, and how the domed roof distributed load so it wouldn't collapse under strong winds. When Thomas and Eleanor set the first cabin posts in Timberline Gulch, those Arctic lessons remained vivid in his mind, but he never had the chance to apply them. Their first Colorado winter made the harshness of the mountains clear. The single-walled pine log cabin, Thomas built in the traditional-style walls 8 to 10 inches thick, chinked with mud and moss, still let the cold wind whistle through the gaps, especially when the wood shrank hard during nights down to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. By January 1891, when a cold snap hit -34 degrees Fahrenheit, even a small crack was enough to let the chill flood in, giving Thomas a severe cold that turned into pneumonia. He died in the cabin so cold that the cup of water by the bed froze along the top edge. After her husband's death, all Eleanor had left was the small notebook Thomas always carried, filled with detailed notes on Arctic stone dome construction, double wall layouts, 6-inch air gap specifications, and the note he had repeated so often, "Wood is only the friend of autumn. In winter, stone is what puts man in his proper place." During their time together, Eleanor had helped Thomas stack stones for a small oven and hearth foundation. She knew which slabs were flat enough to lock corners and which were strong enough for bearing walls. But that skill had never been valued in Timberline Gulch, where every miner believed lodgepole log cabins were the only way to survive at this altitude. The camp miners, settled in their routines for years, lived in single-wall 12x 14-foot log cabins, burning 30-35 pounds of split pine each night to keep the space at a bearable 42 degrees Fahrenheit, viewing that as normal life and the price of mountain winters. They cut and stacked 15 to 20 cords of firewood every fall, knowing by March they might run short and have to burn leftover furniture to stretch the warmth a few more weeks. That was how the men here had done it since 1881, and they saw no reason to change. To them, a woman recently widowed talking about building a double-layer stone dome to winter in could only be desperation disguised as determination. But Eleanor didn't care who believed or didn't. After the winter that took Thomas, her only remaining fear was not the miners' laughter but the cold seeping through cabin cracks once more. She told herself, if the cold took Thomas, she would not let it take anything else. Eleanor began her project in the first week of October, right when the early seasonal snow had not yet thickened on the ground. She chose a low spot between two large offset boulders about 8 yards apart, a location she had observed over the previous 2 winters where the north wind was noticeably deflected and slowed before sweeping down the valley. That was an essential condition for a stone dome to hold its load and retain heat, because Thomas had written clearly in his notebook, if the building site faced direct wind from 3 or more directions, the stone walls would shrink unevenly and develop microcracks after 20-30 days of continuous freezing. Eleanor paced out the site into a 14-foot diameter circle, exactly the size Thomas recorded from an Arctic structure he had lived in for 3 weeks during a minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit cold snap in Baffin. She drove 4 wooden stakes at the cardinal points, strung barbed wire for reference, then used a straight pole to mark the baseline. The mining camp paused to watch for the first 10 minutes, then the laughter started. Someone whistled when they saw her tapping each slab with a small hammer. Others roared when they saw her dragging a nearly 60-pound stone on a homemade lodgepole sled, the face smoothed with an old saw blade to reduce friction. "Stone keeps you warm?" a miner named Harris shouted. "I'd sooner believe snow can cook soup." Another added, "Just wait. She'll be knocking on our cabin doors the first night it snows." But Eleanor simply set one slab down, turned back to the slope, dragged another, and kept going. No reaction, no reply, no glance back. Over those 6 weeks, she averaged 35 to 45 sled trips per day, depending on snow hardness and slope steepness. The stones she chose weighed 20 to 60 pounds, with fairly uniform surface sizes and reasonable flatness to lock corners without excessive mortar. Thomas had written, "A good slab is one that stands on its edge for 2 seconds before falling." And Eleanor tested each one exactly that way. Those that stood went into the use pile. Those that toppled immediately she shoved aside for chinking stones. When the outer wall reached about 18 inches high, she began the inner wall, exactly 6 inches away. She checked that gap with a pre-cut long wooden rod, inserting it between the layers after every stone to ensure the space remained constant. Smaller stones were used as chinking to keep the air gap clear from base to roof, what Thomas called the thing that stops death by draft. In Arctic technique, stone walls only retain heat when no wind penetrates. Sealing the air gap causes heat loss by convection from the outer wall. Leaving it too wide lets wind carry away all warmth in minutes. Eleanor understood that better than anyone in camp. Every evening before the oil lamp went out, she felt each new joint to check if settling from the weight above had shifted it. The walls rose course by course, not fast but steady. When the outer wall hit 3 feet, the miners began treating it as after-work entertainment. They gathered nearby, warming hands at a fire and firing off barbs nonstop. "If she gets the roof on, I'll quit tobacco," one said. Another replied, "Nah, you'll freeze solid before you get the chance." The crowd roared. They must have repeated that joke more than 20 times, and each time Eleanor dragged another stone, placed it precisely, and kept building. By the 3rd week, she began curving the dome. This was the most technically demanding part. Each stone had to be angled inward at 8 to 12 degrees so gravity pressed toward the circle's center, not outward. Too much angle, and the roof would slide. Too little, and the ring wouldn't close, and the dome would fail. To ensure the correct angle, Eleanor used a short rod marked with 2 lines, one at 8 degrees, one at 12. She set the rod on the stone, aligned it, then lowered it into place. Every 10 stones, she stepped back 3 paces to check the curve's continuity. She had no level, no specialized curve measuring tools, but she had eyes trained by Thomas for 3 years, sharp enough to spot uneven load distribution. On November 2, the wind shifted, and wet snow began falling. The ground grew slicker, and on one downhill stone drag, her foot slipped off its footing, her left hand slamming into the sharp edge of a slab. Blood spurted, running down her wrist and dripping onto the snow. She wrapped it with a rag, held it tight for a few minutes to stop the bleeding, then continued placing the prepared stones, hands trembling slightly but pace unchanged. No one in Timberline Gulch recorded it, but that very day Roy Calhoun, the most relentless mocker, went quiet for a while, watching her fall and rise. He didn't help, but he said nothing more that day. By mid-November, the outer wall stood over 3.5 feet, the inner about 3 feet. She began placing longer stones to create shrinking rings, each reducing the diameter by 2 to 4 inches. That technique came straight from the last 3 pages of Thomas's notebook. Even shrinking rings, the roof holds load well. Uneven rings, snow will crush the structure on the 4th day of the storm. Eleanor read that passage every night, and over the next 6 weeks, she worked with the precision of someone who knew a 1-inch error could collapse the whole thing on the coldest night. The weather grew colder, snow deeper. While miners started burning extra wood to keep their cabins above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, Eleanor worked outdoors from sunrise, touching the ridge to when stone joints became too dim to see. She placed 35 to 45 stones per day on average. By month's end, she had moved over 400 stones total. When the final dome ring was set, a nearly 45-pound stone slightly beveled on one edge to fit the apex, the igloo stood complete. Low, round, massive, almost blending into the snow if you didn't look closely. No dimples, no crooked curves, no cracks at the vulnerable wall-roof junction in deep cold. The whole camp stared at the finished work with half disbelief, half mockery. One miner said, "Gotta admit she's stubborn, but let's see how long it stands in wind." Another replied, "Half a winter at most, then she'll crawl back to log like the rest of us." They didn't know and didn't want to know that Eleanor had built to the exact parameters Thomas recorded from a place where cold winds were even more savage than those in the Elk Range. To the miners, it was just an overworked joke. But to Eleanor, it was a vow to preserve life, the only thing standing between her and the winter that had taken the person she loved most. The first cold snap hit Timberline Gulch in the opening week of December. Not the violent blizzard kind that drives people indoors, but a dry, silent, steady cold that dropped temperatures from 12 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, with almost no warning. North winds blew in short bursts, strong enough to shrink the mud moss pitch chinking on log cabins and open tiny gaps the miners knew all too well. Narrow enough not to see through, wide enough to funnel a blast of cold straight into the room in minutes. By morning, most miners were burning 30 to 35 pounds of split pine to hold their cabins around 42 degrees Fahrenheit, the level they called enough to keep your finger joints moving without locking up. Smoke from stovepipes hung low, sagging over cabin roofs like gray curtains, showing outdoor temperatures stable at levels where wood shrank fast and metal frosted white. Inside Eleanor's stone dome, though, the temperature held steady at 55 degrees Fahrenheit after burning only about 7 pounds of wood, less than a fifth of what log cabins consumed. The small stove burned evenly, barely needing more fuel until morning. The thick double stone walls absorbed the scant heat from the fire, held it through the night, then released it slowly, creating a warmth log cabins could scarcely achieve in Colorado's dry cold. No one in camp believed it until a stubborn miner named Nolan, who trusted nothing but pine logs and steel nails, sneaked close to the igloo while Eleanor was fetching water from the creek. He pressed his hand to the stone wall, ready to yank it back, thinking it would be ice cold. But his hand didn't sting. He held it longer, palm warming slightly, then pulled away with rare confusion. Nolan said nothing, just returned to his cabin, but that silence sparked a chain of rumors. By late afternoon, at least 10 people had heard, "That stone wall, it's not cold at all." And by night it became, "The widow's igloo is warmer than Bill's cabin." Bill Thompson's cabin was considered the tightest in camp, built with nearly 10-inch lodgepole, square-notched corners, high-quality chinking, big stove. So, the rumor spread faster than any previous mockery. Inside the igloo, Eleanor sat beside 6-year-old Jacob, his head resting on her shoulder, cheeks rosy from the even warmth radiating off the stone wall behind them. Each time she touched the wall surface, she remembered Thomas's notebook words, "Stone holds the fire's breath. It doesn't heat fast like wood, but once warm it doesn't give it back to winter easily." The stone walls were exactly as Thomas described. They retained heat, stayed stable, had no cold spots, and were barely affected by outside wind. Outside, Minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit wind screamed through cabin gaps, but inside the stone dome, Jacob slept so peacefully Eleanor had to place her hand on his chest to confirm he was still breathing evenly. That feeling, the silence of warmth, was something Eleanor had never experienced in any Timberline winter. By the third day of the snap, a group of miners stood along the path to the igloo, watching from afar. They no longer laughed loudly but spoke quietly, exchanging quick remarks. If she really only burned one bundle like I saw yesterday, then our cabins are eating 5 times the wood. Another replied, maybe she burns at night. The response? No smoke. I was up twice and saw none. Those words were enough to turn initial mockery into curiosity mixed with irritation, the feeling that arises when someone does what the group deems pointless but gets the opposite result. Still, to save face, the miners kept repeating their seasonal refrain. Just wait till February. Real winter hasn't started yet. The major cold wave that swept into Timberline Gulch in late February was unlike any the miners had ever faced. The Leadville weather station had sent warnings 3 days earlier about an Arctic air mass forming over Alberta, moving with steady direction, calm winds, low humidity, high pressure, the exact kind that could drop temperatures so fast even pine wouldn't shrink before cracking. As the cold mass crossed Montana, temperatures fell so rapidly that northern towns recorded 22 degrees Fahrenheit drops in just 4 hours. By the time the wind veered straight toward the Elk Range, every cabin in Timberline Gulch braced for a deep freeze, but no one foresaw its intensity. Day 1 began at minus 33 degrees Fahrenheit. North wind blew steadily, not fierce but strong enough to drive powder snow sideways, rasping against cabin planks with a dry, sharp sound like stretched sandpaper. At minus 33 degrees Fahrenheit, lodgepole shrank about 0.06 inch per foot of length. That sounded trivial, but in a single wall 12x 14-foot cabin built with 10-inch logs, the shrinkage opened the first cracks in less than one night. By 3 a.m., Bill Thompson's cabin started making pop-pop sounds from the east corner wall, like a hammer tapping dry wood. Bill pressed his hand into the gap and yanked it back instantly. Cold wind forced in like high-pressure air, slicing straight through his wool shirt. Carter Briggs's cabin on the north side fared worse. Breath moisture condensed on the wood walls, freezing into thin ice layers in just 1 hour. Inside Eleanor's igloo, the temperature remained steady at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, the stove burning slowly on 15 pounds of wood, the nearly 2-foot-thick stone walls transmitting no cold inside. She checked the chinking stones. None had shifted. The dome held its load perfectly. No vibration. Day 2, the temperature fell to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the threshold where most log cabins began showing frost lines, white frost trails along wood joints, showing the wood's natural moisture being pulled out faster than the cabin could replenish. In such conditions, normal cabins needed at least 65 pounds of wood per night to hold 31-34 degrees Fahrenheit inside, still below comfortable, but enough to prevent limbs from locking. Carter Briggs burned continuously, but his cabin never rose above 30 degrees Fahrenheit. To compensate, he stuffed old rugs and cloth scraps into gaps with no effect. The wood kept shrinking, producing quick, dry cracking sounds like breaking stone. By 10 a.m., one corner of Carter's cabin split open, creating a nearly foot-long gap. Wind rushed in and extinguished the fire near the stove. Carter had to shovel snow to smother the coals for fear of igniting the now taut, dry walls. News of Briggs's cabin splitting spread through camp in half a day. The miners who had mocked Eleanor laughed far less, eyeing her igloo with irritation tinged with unease, though none approached to ask. They still believed log cabins were only temporarily failing, since most had survived several minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit snaps and thought minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit was extreme but manageable. But Eleanor knew otherwise. Minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit was the point where moss chinking in log cabins lost nearly all elasticity. From there, any pressure change would crack cabins faster. Day 3, the cold reached minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. At this level, metal became brittle, ropes froze solid in an hour, and poured water crystallized before hitting the ground. Nighttime cracking sounded sharp as small gunshots. Crack, crack. Sharp and decisive, rousing people trying to sleep in cabins, making them stare at each other in the dark with unspoken fear. Bill Thompson's cabin developed an 18-inch horizontal crack in the north wall. He tried stuffing more cloth, hides, anything, but all shrank in minutes. By noon, his cabin held only 34 degrees Fahrenheit, despite burning nearly 65 pounds of wood, the day's high. Carter Briggs had to move his bed next to the stove, but constant drafts left his fingers frost-numbed. Nolan suffered mild frostbite on his left ear after only 4 minutes outside fetching wood. A strange silence blanketed Timberline Gulch. The silence of cracking wood, the silence of men realizing their cabins were gradually losing to temperatures they had never met. Meanwhile, inside the igloo, the temperature held at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, varying no more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit all day. The stone walls didn't shrink. The air gap stayed constant. Outside, wind rebounded off the stone surface, finding no entry. Eleanor stood listening. No cracking. No wind whistling in. Just the rare piece of a structure bearing load as designed. Day 4, the cold mass peaked at minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit. At this level, log cabins no longer cracked, they split. A single large tear could shift an entire wall section out of place. At 3 a.m., Hank Mercer's cabin near the east edge of camp developed a crack from base to near the roof. When he touched it, wind blasted straight into his face like a vent. Less than 2 hours later, a 3-foot section of log fell away, exposing snow outside. Hank had to abandon his cabin and run to Bill's to shelter. Outside, winds blew at 30 miles per hour, creating wind chill below minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to cause frostbite in exposed skin after just 45 seconds. Inside Briggs's cabin, panic set in. The fire kept going out from wind, sucking through wall splits. Briggs wedged a thick plank to block it, but the wood froze instantly, sticking to his hand when he tried to pull it free. By noon, he trembled so badly he couldn't hold wood long enough to feed the stove. Nolan's better cabin dropped to only 29 degrees Fahrenheit. No one said it aloud, but all knew the log cabins had entered structural failure, a term Scandinavian origin miners used for the moment a cabin could no longer handle deep cold no matter how much wood was burned. In the igloo, Eleanor added 15 pounds of wood to maintain heat, but really, she only lit the stove to boil water. The stone walls still held 51-52 degrees Fahrenheit with no sign of cracking. Jacob slept soundly, unaware that outside was a temperature that could kill in 3 minutes without shelter. Day 4 was also when miners began hearing their structures fail. Sharp crack, like exploding stone. Pop, like nails springing from wood. Thud, of falling logs. No cabin was quiet. Some huddled in blankets, others paced restlessly before the stove, poking coals as if keeping the fire meant keeping life. By dusk, despair was palpable. Groups of miners began glancing toward the igloo. No one spoke, but their eyes calculated what 3 months earlier they had laughed at. The igloo's low door, yet it was preserving life inside. The sky darkened faster than any other night. Wind gusted in bursts, rolling snow into horizontal streaks, blotting out cabin lights. In those conditions, any repair attempt was futile. Any material, cloth, wood, hide, froze rigid in minutes outside and lost sealing ability. Some miners showed frostbite on ears, cheeks, fingers, and then the inevitable moment arrived, when wind lashed snow across faces at the end of the 4th night, with minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit recorded at the nearest monitoring station. 3 men, who had once mocked Eleanor Carter Briggs, Nolan Reed, and Hank Mercer had no choice but to seek the low door of the igloo. On the 4th night of the cold snap, with north wind scouring the snow so fiercely no one could keep eyes open standing outside more than 10 seconds, Carter Briggs, Nolan Reed, and Hank Mercer finally had to leave their cabins. None said it aloud, but all understood the cabins could no longer hold warmth. Walls kept splitting, stoves kept extinguishing from backdraft, and the thermometer Briggs had brought from Missouri stood at only 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below water's freezing point. They threw on fox fur coats, wrapped scarves, hunched against the wind to avoid being knocked down, and followed the faint snow trail toward Eleanor's igloo. The distance wasn't far, just over 100 yards, but at minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill possibly below minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, even 1 minute exposed could cause frostbite. They walked heads down as wind pressed straight against their chests, each step trembling. Nolan fell twice when his feet went numb. Hank hauled him up with both hands. Briggs kept panting curses at his own cabin as if it had betrayed him at the moment he needed it most. When they reached the rounded stone face of the igloo, Briggs pressed his frost-numbed hand to the surface and recoiled in shock because it wasn't freezing. For a few seconds, no one spoke. They just leaned against the dome like men who had found the only ground winter hadn't erased. Briggs knocked on the low door, voice choked with cold. "Eleanor, it's us." The low wooden door, built exactly in the Arctic igloo style to prevent heat loss, cracked open a sliver of light. A rush of warmth hit their faces. So strong and clear, all three inhaled reflexively. Eleanor stood there, face unsurprised, only tilting slightly to let them crawl in. The low doorway forced them to crouch near the ground as they entered, and from the first moment their knees touched the stone floor inside the igloo. They knew the difference. No drafts, no cold running underfoot, no wood creaking. Inside was 52 degrees Fahrenheit, not the pleasant warmth of autumn, but absolute high mountain warmth, air enough to restore feeling to limbs, to keep breath from frosting, to make them realize they were still fully alive instead of merely existing in cabins tearing apart. Jacob slept on the small bed against the stone wall, the wool blanket over him undisturbed by cold. On the small stove set against the south wall, water in the pot still steamed gently. Hank looked around, touched the stone wall, and froze. "Not a single crack," he said softly, as if speaking louder would break the fragile balance keeping them alive. Eleanor only nodded and added a forearm-sized stick of wood to the stove, not the desperate tossing log cabins forced when temperatures fell below zero. Briggs, still breathing hard, scanned the room and asked the question he had laughed himself to tears over 3 months earlier. How does it hold heat like that? Eleanor sat beside the stove, voice so calm the three men felt ashamed of their own panic. She pointed to the wall. Double wall. Outer layer thick to hold heat and bear load. Inner layer thinner but tighter. And between them, a 6-inch air gap. She traced a thin line along the wall junction with her hand. That gap stops wind from transmitting cold. It cuts convection. And stone itself holds heat longer than wood thermal mass. Stone doesn't heat fast, but once warm it doesn't give it back to winter easily. Nolan frowned, piecing together scattered heat transfer knowledge he'd heard. "So, wind can't get in?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, wind can't penetrate the outer layer. Chinking stones keep the gap between walls even. No path for wind to enter. It blocks conduction from outside, limits convection inside, and there's almost no radiation from the stone surface into the room. That's why the temperature doesn't drop." Briggs looked up at the dome where stones locked at perfect angles with no trace of crack despite wind outside strong enough to rip off a wooden roof. He raised a hand to his forehead, then sighed, not the exhale of exhaustion, but of someone realizing his own mistake. Hank said quietly, We're wrong about you." Eleanor didn't answer, only pulled the wool blanket higher over Jacob and poured hot water into a wooden cup she handed to Nolan, who was shaking as if he had never shaken before. The three men sat against the stone wall, shoulders slowly relaxing as body heat returned. They looked at each other, eyes mixing gratitude, amazement, and heavy shame for spending 3 months laughing at what tonight had saved their lives. As the room's warmth melted the last ice from their eyelashes, Briggs bowed his head and said, voice so low it sounded like wind, "I called you a dreamer. Turns out, you were the only one who really saw winter." When the great cold finally retreated from Timberline Gulch and the sky turned pale blue for the first time after nearly a week locked by north wind, the miners stepped from their cabins as if they had survived a mountain collapse. Each step on the snow cracked with brittle cold, and the first thing they did was inspect what they still called home. Within hours, the whole camp realized the devastation. 9 cabins heavily cracked, gaps widened so wind blew through like pipes, 3 cabins beyond saving, walls shrunk until they pulled free of log notches, eaves torn off frames by gusts. Many stood silent before the wreckage, as if witnessing an old mountain rule, the rule of relying on wood finally exposed in its greatest weakness. Then they turned to the one place unchanged, Widow Eleanor Whitford's stone dome. The igloo stood exactly as it had the last morning of November when Eleanor placed the capstone. Not a single hairline crack, not one stone shifted, the 6-inch air gap between walls still uniform as when she adjusted each chinking piece. When Briggs and Nolan opened the door and stepped out that morning, the leftover warmth from the previous night followed them outside like final proof that this structure had not only saved 3 men, it preserved the belief that some Building methods surpassed mining country tradition. By noon, nearly the entire camp had gathered before the igloo. They measured everything: wall thickness, air gap width, dome pitch, low door size, just like miners in the old stories once circled Lars's dome to understand what had kept them alive. Those who had mocked Eleanor most wrote down the most, forming a silent circle, bending low, feeling every stone joint like apprentices learning a new trade. Roy Calhoun, the one who had declared stone walls would crack faster than wood, stood a long time at the igloo door, then said something no one thought they'd hear from him. She knew what we never bothered to notice. In the summer of 1893, tiny Timberline Gulch witnessed something unprecedented in mining camp history. 6 new stone domes rose, each following Eleanor's design: double walls, 6-inch gap, locked stone dome, low door. The men who had laughed at her now spent entire months digging foundations, stacking stone, measuring every dimension from notes taken off the first igloo. Some even came to Eleanor's place each evening to ask more about selecting flat stones, placing chinking, determining angles so the dome locked gravity at the right point. She turned no one away. Whenever asked why she shared knowledge instead of keeping it to herself, she only answered, "Winter has already taken enough from me." Years later, when Jacob had grown and left the gulch, people still told of the -47 degrees Fahrenheit great cold as a reminder that one person's knowledge can sometimes change an entire community's fate. Jacob often retold his mother's story in the towns he passed through, about a small widow who single-handedly dragged 400 stones over 6 weeks to build what men called a joke, about nights when wind howled outside while the igloo held 52 degrees Fahrenheit on half the wood log cabin swallowed uselessly, about the moment 3 trembling men knocked on the low door and found the warmth they had once denied. That story spread far beyond Timberline Gulch, becoming a quiet lesson of the Colorado mountains. Sometimes what is mocked most is what endures longest. And whenever anyone asked Jacob what gave his mother faith in a structure the whole camp ridiculed, he always repeated something. She sighed on the first snowy night. "It's not the cruelty of winter that keeps people alive, but the eyes that see what lasts, even when the whole world laughs." If you cherish tales of forgotten American survival and ingenuity from the old days, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Thank you for watching. See you again in stories that reach the depths of human resilience.